Well, good morning, everybody. Oh, I'm definitely mic'd up, aren't I? Oh my God. I am mic'd up. Well, thank you all very much for joining us here on our panel on predatory publishing. My name is Emilio Bruna, and I'm a professor in the Department of Wildlife Ecology and Conservation, also in the Center for Latin American Studies here at UF. But these issues are near and dear to my heart because I'm also the editor-in-chief, soon to be editor-in-chief emeritus of the journal Predatory, which is a journal of the Association for Tropical Biology and Conservation. And I'm also on the board of directors for the Data Triad, which is a digital repository that works with authors to archive the data that's associated with their articles. So I was really thrilled to accept this invitation to come and meet some of our specialists here on these issues and ask them questions for the benefit of people here. So I'm actually going to let Terry and Maggie will introduce themselves, and if that's okay, we'll run through those introductions, and then I think we have a couple of questions we'd like to get started with. We'll have an opportunity there for our panel to answer them, and I think we'll open it up to questions too from the audience.
Hello, so I'm Maggie Ansell, and I feel like I'm the least qualified on this panel, but that's okay, I'm here anyway. So I'm the Associate Chair of Faculty at the Health Science Center Libraries, and then I'm also the Nursing and Consumer Health Liaison Librarian. So that means I work with the College of Nursing, and then anybody who's interested in health information for the layperson. So I'm here because I handle this issue a lot, sort of on the ground level, working with faculty in the College of Nursing to choose appropriate publications. That's the service I provide to them.
Hi, I'm Perry Collins. I'm our scholarly communications librarian. Let's see, a few of the major things that I do. Many people know me as the copyright librarian, so I'm the main person in the libraries who can help consult on issues of copyright in research or in the classroom. I also manage our Open Access Publishing Fund, which has been going on for a few years, and that offers subsidies for open access publication in journals that do charge fees for those publications. So if you have questions about that, I'm happy to chat about that program. And then I also I am the head of our Affordable UF working group as well. That's something that we have in the libraries and really with partners across campus where we're trying to work on increasing affordability to course materials for students.
Hi, I'm Melissa Ruthlefson. I'm an Associate Dean in the Smathers Libraries, and I'm the Faculty Director of the Health Science Center Library. So I oversee our library here in Gainesville and the one in Jacksonville. And I'm on this panel primarily because I'm personally extremely opinionated about this topic and can rant for a very long time about a lot of the different issues. So all of my opinion should be taken with the grain of salt that this is the personal view of Melissa and not the view of the libraries.
Hold on to the mic then.
Okay.
Because, this gives you an opportunity to get that rant out of the way first thing in the morning. So maybe you wouldn't mind defining, kind of how you define predatory publishing in the first place, right? What is that? And bearing in mind that the semester starts, I think, August.
Okay. Good to know. And in fact, that is one of the very topics upon which I'd like to rant for a long time, which is the designation of these journals as predatory. There's a lot of debate in the library literature and amongst those of us in scholarly communications about the use of this term. It was really coined by a person who was probably not the most ethical individual on the planet, and the term has really come to be used and by a lot of commercial publishers to vilify open access publications. So in general, when I'm thinking about predatory publications, I might include commercial publishers amongst those who are predatory because they really are trying to exploit us. But what I think that the big issue for a lot of researchers is really around those publications that are scams. They're not real journals. They're really just there to about their publishing practices. They're going to deceptively ask for money after you've actually submitted your article. And those, I think, are the real challenge. The use of the term predatory, I have some issues with.
So, I mean, term aside, then, since it's strictly versus not. So what we're talking about here is, we're used to thinking of journals, and it sounds like as you send off your paper, it goes through the process of peer review. After a couple of rounds, maybe a couple more rounds, eventually it's going to make its way out into the kind of broader canon of scholarship in some area. What you're talking about here is submit your paper, and 48 hours later, congratulations, it's been accepted, and you can add this publication to your list. And what, in retrospect, it immediately becomes clear that what you just did was pay someone to take your text, format it, make it look sort of nice, and call it a publication, right? It's a scam.
About whether to even include the word predatory in the name of this panel, because it is such a big part of the conversation and something that comes up all the time. But I think all of us agree that we are trying to use it less in a lot of ways. We can have ethical questions about a lot of different kinds of journals, like you were saying, including some that might be considered sort of legitimate. But we also see predatory being used as a very broad brush often to say, well, that journal, I don't know, the design of their website doesn't look great, or the description of the journal isn't in perfect English, or things like that are often taken as indicators of something being predatory when in fact it's not.
Yeah, so I guess what I would say is like a lot of times we use predatory in a term when we're really just talking about something that means amateur. So maybe a small society that has just started a new journal, maybe has an inexperienced editor, and they have all of the good intentions in the world. They're just trying to get their act together. So this can be a good journal, but because we use that paintbrush of predatory on it, even though they aren't being deceitful, because I think that's the big rubric is, are they being deceitful? Are they lying to you about their physical address, what their impact factor is if they have one, or anything like that. Yeah, are they making up an impact factor? Yeah, who's on their editorial board? That's a huge one. It's that element of deceit that's very important rather than the element of polish. Now, the element of sort of polish and prestige, that's a whole nother conversation when it comes to like choosing a journal. Like you might not choose to be in the fledgling journal of a very small society because you need your paper to make a bigger splash than that. And that's your choice. Like you can do that, or you can choose like, well, I want to help get this fledgling open access journal off the ground because I think it has a very important mandate and reaches an audience that doesn't normally have access to these types of things. So that's a different kind of conversation than the what is actually kind of almost a very much a legal term. The way that pyramid scheme has become kind of a legal term. Predatory publishing is very much a legal accusation you're making about bad business practices. So to say that just because there's typos on the website that they're predatory is a very big leap to make. So that's kind of why I think we're urging caution with the use of that term.
So I'll probably still fall into it, but let's say we're trying to steer away from legitimate versus illegitimate journals or something like that, right? How can I actually find out if a journal is somewhere that I could publish in and then not be, and not think this is going to be a problem when I sit down with my chair for my annual evaluation versus someone who basically, ripped me off, took my money, and left me, who had the best of intentions to publish my research, in the lurch because it's not in a venue that's at all respected or even recognized by them.
Yeah. So I'm only going to speak briefly on this because I'm sure there's opinions. But I think for me, the number one thing is, have you heard of it? Have you read articles from this journal? Do you know the people involved? Your fields aren't that big. Maybe they are. I shouldn't make that assumption. But generally, if you are actively involved in your field, you know the main players in it. So you should recognize maybe the name of the editor, or you should at least have heard it, or at least maybe you should have read some papers from it. So if it really comes from out of the blue, I think that's the first. Granted, it could be a new journal. It could be something that's, you just haven't heard of this journal before because you're new to your field. That's fine. But really, that idea, part of what it, to me, I think is one of the big signals is this, like, who are these guys kind of question. And then you can go and investigate, and if that answer is not satisfactory to you, then that's a big warning flag. So.
Yeah, I mean, I would just follow up. I think often there's a real impulse to try to turn to lists of good and bad journals. This is something we hear about. This is a lot of the reason the term predatory publishing even got started, was with this idea of having a blacklist. I think as librarians, increasingly, we're trying really hard to say, try not to use those blacklists, or at least only use them as one of many indicators, because often it's really unclear why things make it onto this black mark list of something that you shouldn't be publishing in, or why something is bad. I do feel more comfortable with lists like the Directory of Open Access Journals or other indices that make very transparent why something is being included as more of a good journal or something that's been reviewed. Yeah, and not even necessarily whitelist as if these are perfect journals or there's no issues with these at all, but at least that there's some transparency around how did something get onto that list in the first place. The other thing I would point out is right above us is this website, Think, Check, Submit. This is a very simple site. It basically offers a checklist of questions you should be asking yourself when you're going to publish in a journal. So on here, this is a home page, but if you go to the check link there's a nice selection of questions, some of which Maggie mentioned. Is there an actual address that you can verify? Do you recognize names of editorial board members? And sometimes if you're really unsure, can you email one of them to say, like, how has your experience been? Have you actually worked with this journal, or are they just sort of putting your name up there? All of this takes some time, but I think the 10 minutes or 15 minutes is usually worth it to avoid falling into one of these scams that we're talking about.
I would concur with all of those. Sometimes it takes me as a librarian a while to figure out whether or not something is a deceptive journal. It's not necessarily just immediately clear, but I would say one thing that you can do is, of course, consult with your librarian who can try to help you with that. But I think one other thing that is one of my rules of thumb is if it comes as a solicitation via email, 99% of the time it's probably from a scam journal or scam conference. Not always, of course, but again, if it's something that you haven't heard of, your colleagues haven't heard of, chances are pretty good that it's not something that you would want to be involved with. It's not necessarily 100% always the case, of course. But it's something that I think that many of us who are overwhelmed by these emails that are coming into our inboxes every day can just easily delete and then not worry about them.
I wanted to follow up on one of the comments there, which is, is this perhaps a journal that you've cited or read in or heard of? And there are something like 22,000 journals currently today, so it's hard to have heard of all of them. And I think we also, our first place to turn and look is in something like Scopus or the Web of Science, maybe your Google Scholar, and not all journals are indexed in these databases. So there are lots of good journals, legitimate journals, typically not based in Europe or the United States or Canada, that might be in there. So how do we drill down, given that we might not have heard of a journal, that doesn't necessarily mean it's not true.
Sure. No, I think that's a really good question, and it's a difficult one because I think it's easy to be overwhelmed by the number of options out there. I think being able to be sort of intentional and to keep an open mind about where you're going to publish and being aware of your networks, but also being aware, like you say, that there might be other options out there. I think one of the reasons I mentioned Directory of Open Access Journals, actually, I'll pull it up. Oh, I think it's right. One reason that I do like this list is because I think they've been increasingly mindful of, thanks Maggie, of including international journals across disciplines. And so this is one place to start where you'll find the names of a lot that have gone through some kind of review. Again, this resource is less about review from the perspective of a particular discipline or a particular field. They're looking more at things like, do they have transparent policies? Do you understand what your rights are to your article once it's been published? And a lot of questions more along those lines that are looking a lot at sort of publication ethics. So I think that's one place to start. And I think beyond that, I think it's being able to sort of work backwards and think about what your goals are for your publication. I think sometimes there will be pressure to publish in journals that are indexed in places like Web of Science, and other times you might really be seeking to make some of those partnerships internationally with a practitioner audience, thinking about what is actually the best place for your research and seeking those out.
And as far as understanding, the difference between, okay, this is just a journal I've never heard of versus this is just a journal I've never heard of because it's not really a journal, I think really does involve a little bit of detective work. I spend a lot of time on these sites, just sort of checking out things like, let me see if they have a very clear and transparent editorial policy. So the Directory of Open Access Journals does a lot of this work for us, but we can sort of imitate that same work ourselves. Just by going through and reading, like, oh, look, they do make it very transparent exactly how the peer review process happens, or exactly how sort of what their editorial criteria are, and exactly, and obviously, like, if they do follow any specific publisher guidelines like COPE and things like that. So, I forget what the yes, the Committee on Publication Ethics has a set of standards or guidelines. And any good journals will attempt to follow them. They're not easy. They're definitely a high standard. But if they specifically saying we follow COPE guidelines in these ways, and they don't just say, because a lot of them will say, oh yes, we follow COPE guidelines. And you're like, do you really though? And so you kind of have to really kind of investigate exactly. Do you feel like you have an understanding of the publication process of this journal through their website? Or is there a very clear way you can find out more information? If not, then that's kind of maybe where more concern can be happening, because it is sort of this black box of mystery of like, I don't know how they run their journals. And I think that's a big indicator of like, okay, maybe if I haven't heard of these guys, how do I tell the difference between I just didn't know about this journal versus I shouldn't know about this journal?
COPE you can actually search on their website for what journals or publishers are signatories to the COPE guidelines, and a lot of journals actually may not even know that that they're on there, but they are on there. Yeah.
I would just add, we've talked a lot about how you can tell the difference and a few rules of thumb of things to look at, but one rule of thumb that I've heard a lot that I would like to disabuse people of is the idea that if they charge money for publication, that it is a predatory journal, and that is just simply not the case. A lot of times this happens, I've noticed, especially in the medical field, where people will get the idea that if it's an open access journal that charges fees, that it fits into this whole discipline of scam kinds of journals. And there are many, many, many thousand of excellent open access journals out there that do charge fees. So that's definitely not a rule of thumb that you want to adhere to. One of the semi-interesting components of that is that if it's a legitimate and excellent open access journal, chances are that it will either be free for submission, or it will charge a very high open access rate, so $2,000, $3,000, versus the ones that are considered scam journals often will charge $150 or something. So that's definitely something to be careful of, not to conflate in your mind. If it's charging, it's predatory. That's not the case.
And I'm going to get into those differences in a second, but before we move on to it, I was hoping that for one last kind of issue of red flags, we've all gotten the emails, and so it's pretty easy to tell some of them apart. When I've been invited to, submit to a journal on advances in nursing science because of my recent work on herbivory and tropical plants by, chrysomeliid beetles or something, you can pretty much figure out that their algorithm isn't working too well. But there are, big publishers do send out solicitations. Individual, journal editors might be putting together a special issue, and so might write particular authors. There might be really important, legitimate publishers that some people have never heard of. I mean, maybe people have heard of Wiley or, Springer or Nature, but maybe they're less familiar with Hindawi or Frontiers Press, so when you get that email, or, what are some of the, we've talked about some of these red flags, but I'm particularly interested in the publishers themselves and whether the indication of who's publishing this journal, staying away from predatory practice, but rather, can you tell us, what are some of the big publishers of more legitimate journals that we might be more comfortable with?
Well, I would say one of the red flags for an email for me is, of course, if they misaddress me. That's always a big red flag, of course. But quite often, if you receive a solicitation from an actual editor for a journal, the tone will often be more personal instead of just obviously being some sort of form letter. So that's one clue and indication. But actually, that's a good point that you bring up, I think, about publishers, because looking for the publisher is actually one of the easiest ways to figure out whether or not a journal is a scam publication or not. If it is, if you find the publisher name and you just search for them on Google, if you can find information about them, chances are it might actually be a halfway decent publisher. If you can't find information about them, or if it's very limited or sketchy, or if they're the only ones talking about themselves, chances are it might not be a particularly good publisher. Most of the big publishers are, for example, going to have Wikipedia entries. So you can at least try and figure out from that whether or not this publisher actually exists.
I think it's true. I think I'm trying to think of other sort of red flags. I think we haven't really talked about the time to publication, or I think you mentioned that briefly, but that's one thing often that's a little bit difficult, where often we want our work to be reviewed and to get it out there as quickly as possible, but that's something to be really cautious about. In some of these emails, will say, oh, you'll get it, we'll be publishing this as soon as possible, and it'll just be a couple of days, or like we have really quick turnaround, and that often is a red flag, where often there are journals that can say legitimately, we really do try to speed up this process, or we're an emerging journal, we don't have the sort of bulk of submissions, but at the same time, we are clear about what our actual peer review process is, and we're actually following what we say we're doing.
And the one caveat I would give to the Google the publisher, because most legitimate publishers of a Wikipedia article are the very famous publishers who are scams. So recently, the Federal Trade Commission, FTC, just won a lawsuit against Omics and IMedGen, which are these two huge scam publishing and conference outfits. They basically were able to win a lawsuit saying you disserved the American public by following bad business practices to the point where you broke the law. So not all journals will get to that point. Even scam journals or unethical journals will not get to that point. There are some big name publishers out there that are following what we would consider unethical business practices, but they haven't broken the law, so they still exist. But that's an important part as well, is to really just say, oh, they have a Wikipedia article, it's fine. It's like, no, go read the Omics Wikipedia article. You'll find some fun stuff there. So that's kind of another element, is check to see if there's any news articles. The little Google News tab is really a handy part to see if there's any big splashes about someone's done a sting with this journal and has discovered that they used iPhone generated text and were able to publish a journal article through this journal. That's obviously a sign. So things like that.
Yeah. So it sounds like the original question. How do we identify these? It means homework. It means using DOAJ. It means looking at COPE. Maybe it means asking around. I think it's worth coming back into the other question, which is that I think in a lot of these conversations and the terms that come up, I tend to run across it. My dean's not here, so I tend to run across it in conversations with deans or more senior administrators, my college only. The difference between open access, online journal, kind of pay to publish, and that kind of confusion that surrounds these terms, some of it historical baggage, some of it how quickly the publication industry is changing, and these terms get used interchangeably a lot. I think it might be useful then having kind of anchored one side of that, if we could predatory or illegitimate. At this end, can we define and maybe talk a little bit about how that differs from open access journals, subscription journals, and online journals, some of which may be subscription or open access?
Yeah, so the move to digital publishing was just a very disruptive technology for scholarly communications. And so you did have these very, the number of publishers and the number of journals was very much limited by who had printing presses, who could, printing press makes me sound like I'm like hundreds of years ago, but who had the publishing facilities, who could actually get the stuff out in print and send it to people's homes, and that, or offices or wherever, and that it made a certain sense. So the move to online has made a lot of this easier. It's made a lot of, it's streamlined a lot of the process, such that like now we have questions about why are we still paying the same prices or triple the price for the same journal that they don't even have to print anymore. But that's a separate conversation. But there's this idea of like, because of how easy it is comparatively to set up a journal electronically or online, you'll hear librarians use the term electronically a lot because, I don't know, it's a very librarian term. But to set up an electronic or an online journal, it's the barrier to access is much lower. And so as a result, a lot, smaller companies, smaller groups, societies can get involved, which is really great as far as democratizing the process. It's no longer a few big folk who are in charge of getting information out there. That's beautiful. But, of course, the side effect of that is that you do have, people who just want to make a buck, taking advantage of the low cost of entry to try and provide a scam. And the general model of scamming has sort of taken advantage of sort of the open access model, which I'll let Carrie talk about.
Sure. I mean, Melissa got at this a bit already. I mean, open access is a huge umbrella term, obviously, and we're talking about lots of different business models, some of which are fee-based, many of which are not. Many universities, for instance, have stepped up to host a lot of journals and to provide a lot of infrastructure. We have Chelsea Johnston in the room, my colleague, who runs our online journals program out of the libraries, where we offer a lot of that kind of support. And a lot of this is really working on thinking about models where we have academy-owned infrastructure for our own publishing. And sometimes there are fees involved there to keep up, to hire graduate assistants to keep up some of that infrastructure, but often there aren't.
But Mary, what we're talking about at its core is, the motivation behind open access is, before if you wanted to read something, you had to be a subscriber. It was behind some kind of paywall.
Yes.
And now anybody in the world can read the research you've done, right?
Exactly, yes. So really,
kind of motivation behind it, but then what you're getting at is then that there are different paths by which we can get there.
That's right, yes. So we really have moved, I think, slowly toward understanding that it is a perfectly legitimate thing to have work that is open and more democratized, to have work that is easily read by a lot of people. I think there was a sense, and still sometimes is a persistent sense, that the more open your work is, somehow it loses in value, or you're going outside of these sort of elite circles of people who might cite your work, or that it might be misused in some ways. But I think actually we're seeing that there's just a much broader reach as we move toward an open access model.
So then before we move on to the kind of last stage, though, what you're saying is, so open access is about anybody in the world being able to take advantage of the work that you've done. Where this starts to get confusing and starts to, people sometimes, it makes it difficult to see the distinction between kind of some of these predatory or illegitimate journals and open access, is the question of paying, right? So, will you, maybe for those who might not be familiar
Sure.
with what's the difference between a scam journal saying, give us $100 or $200 or $65 in publishing your paper versus, PLOS Biology or the Proceedings of the Royal Society of London saying, give us $500 or $1,000 and we'll publish your paper.
Yeah. A lot of it is transparency. You want to be able to go to the website and see a really clear list of what is being charged and what you'll be expected to pay, and clear outlines of if you need something like a waiver or you have questions about it, who to contact, when in the process you should be doing that, all of those kinds of things. You don't ever want to see something that's really buried or maybe not see it at all until after you submit and essentially have your work held ransom. And so unfortunately, this is, again, where homework is the only real answer. And I think it's fair to say most legitimate journals have done a better and better job of making those fees pretty clear, and there'll usually be some kind of tab or specific section of the author guidelines. But definitely look for those. The Directory of Open Access Journals also lists article processing charges. So being really aware of that, and that helps obviously you too, so you can start thinking about where this funding source is coming from. Do you need to tweak a grant or write money into a grant to pay for that? Do you need to talk to the library and say, is there funding available, or your department? So that's important as well.
Do all open access journals charge an article processing charge?
Absolutely not. Only about 70% of open access journals do not charge any kind of fee. There are many prominent journals that do, obviously, and I think we hear often about journals like PLOS that do charge fees. But that, again, is an example where they've been very transparent about those fees and what they're charging and why.
I will say I published an article in PLOS One once, and which is sort of one of those journals that it will take everything depending on whether your methods are sound. And it was one of the best peer reviewing experiences I ever had. We got some of the most thoughtful comments, really helped improve the quality of my science, much more so than some journals that I published in that were through traditional publishers. But I kind of want to get back to your other point about the deans and other administrators talking about some of these issues and the differences between them. And this kind of gets into, again, my personal opinion, but my personal opinion is that we need to blow up the tenure and promotion system, first of all, because it's harming science. Second of all, thank you. Second of all, it brings all of us to the point where we're using the container, i.e. the journal name and brand, as an indicator of the quality of our science. And that is simply not the case. Depending on where you publish, you can be publishing an article in Science that was completely fraudulent. And in fact, some of the big name journals have much higher retraction rates than some of the lower name journals. So unfortunately, I think that because some of these myths still persist, and I know as an associate dean who has to do a lot of faculty reviews, it really is easy to say, oh yeah, that article was published in Journal of the Medical Library Association. That's so much better than this article that was published in that other journal, without reading it. It's easy, but I think that we really need to get out there and educate a lot of our administrators about what it really means and try to divorce the content from the container. And I think that that's going to become more necessary as things like preprint servers, where you can publish a peer-reviewed copy of your article online, become more common. They're kind of available in most major science disciplines now. I think it's also going to become more common as people are really starting to self-publish. And if you use something like Center for Open Science and the Open Science Framework for your publications, there's all these changes that are coming that are enabled by technology. We need to kind of be on top of some of those and realize that pretty soon journal brand names are just not going to be what we need to be looking at.
I'm down with the not use journal names as proxy. I can't wait for those changes to be implemented. Having been at a university a while, I'm guessing like a lot of people here, I'm not optimistic it's going to happen next year, maybe not the year after, it may take a little longer. So until then, is there a message there about whether, people should be drawing assumptions about the quality of the journal, the review process, the rigor with which the scholarship is reviewed, and whether people might really be excited about having an article published in a particular journal for all the kind of perverse incentive reasons that we think about, and whether that and open access are mutually incompatible. Do they overlap? I mean, should should someone who's looking at someone's file think like, oh, this is a good thing. They publish in a particular journal that is open access as opposed to saying open access journals. Really, but we'd still rather it not be open access. Can we talk about what the overlap between, for lack of a better term, and, quality, prestige, top shelf, and whether something is open access or not?
Yeah, I can start. Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot. I think one of the questions we had talked about a bit was sort of the benefits of open access. And one of the things that we immediately talk about are citation metrics. There are a lot of studies around journal impact factor and open access. And I think we're often trying to put open access in the same box. We're trying to judge it in exactly the same way. And we can do that. I mean, that certainly happens. And sometimes it's what we have to do for promotion and tenure. But I also think a lot of these models that Melissa is talking about are thinking about how to change that container too, and how to think differently about the ways in which we actually measure impact. So everything from things like alt metrics, where we're looking at other kinds of conversations that might be happening in less formal places like social media or newsletters, to completely different kinds of publication platforms where you're putting draft manuscripts, data. Emily talked about data dryad. And that's obviously sort of beyond the scope of this conversation, but there are just a lot of, I think, interesting conversations we're having about how can we sort of balance this need to keep talking about these traditional metrics, even as we question whether they're really valuable.
So we've got, predatory or scam journals. We've got open access journals where the price of publishing and reviewing and, getting it out to the world has been shifted from libraries or institutional subscriptions to either the authors defraying some of the costs, or in the case of, say, most of the journals in South America, for instance, the government picking up the tab for publishing scientific research, or consortia governments picking up the tab. So we've got open access, got predatory and scam. What about electronic journals? And can you maybe tell us a little bit about when someone says it's an electronic journal? Yeah. What does that mean?
It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean at all. It's basically a method of distribution, and it's a method of distribution that pretty much every journal that I'm aware of sticks to, unless you have something that's very hyper local. Your electronic is a meaningless term these days. It's every journal, from a major one to the scam one, all across the spectrum, will be using electronic or online as a format. It is just a descriptor and a rather one that doesn't have I can't even think off the top of my head of a single journal that's just entirely print anymore. Oh yeah, yes. I'm sorry. I'm in the health sciences, so that is also influencing things. And that is just definitely an evolution, even beyond journals, into books themselves. We'll use term monographs, so I apologize for that. But books themselves are moving into the ebook format, and that's becoming more and more common. And having print copies of the books is not going the way that wildebeest. We still really love having our physical experiences of books and journals. That's why we print out all those PDFs of those online journal articles we find. But our methods of distributing the work have changed, just because there is a lot of reduced costs with having an electronic format. So it is a very cost-effective option, and it does get it places that it would normally go. So that's another big, huge plus of moving to this kind of electronic format, is that it was the first step in the democratization process, and then open access was sort of the next, which is it went from being, okay, I'm going to pay an online fee now for this online journal, to, okay, now I don't pay any fee, and it's actually the researcher who pays, which is another question, which is why things like there are new deals coming out. I'm sure everyone heard of the big University of California blow up with Elsevier, and that was, all that blow up aside, that was because they were trying to flip the paying model. So instead of libraries paying the cost of subscription for non-open access journals, libraries would pay the cost of publishing in open access journals, so that their researchers could do so without having to pay the ATCs. That was what the big issue was, is they were trying to change sort of the big payment and deal model that publishers and libraries have to make. So that was kind of another big part of that. Sorry, I know.
No, I think most of the
I'll just also say in terms of electronic journals, especially in the health sciences, but I imagine there are some other disciplines in which this is true. There are many journals out there that, even though they still have a print edition, pediatrics is one that comes to mind. The electronic version is the version of record. The print version is not the version of record. And this is, I think, this has been a step that's been taken by a lot of journals now, and because electronic things can get updated more frequently. So if there's an error, if there is a retraction, they can make that change more easily. And so it's become that the electronic journal is actually the important journal and the print is a supplement. So it's just, for people who do prefer to flip through things. This is not uncommon. British Medical Journal, BMJ, is another one that does this. They only publish abbreviated forms of their articles in the print version, and then the full versions, the version of record, is the electronic version.
For someone who loves the smell of reprints when they showed up in my mail, and that's, it doesn't, my Macintosh does not smell as good as my reprints, but
no.
But I mean, so really what we're talking about is a content delivery system here, and that's it. And in fact, on an online-only journal, it's not that it's, someone's web page that they'll publish a paper on. What it means is that in a lot of cases, the journal approached the society and said, hey, we would really love to cut down on the cost of publishing your journal, and we can return some of that, and maybe the way to do that is by only printing it out if someone requests it.
Yeah, I mean, that's what the Journal of Medical Library Association recently transitioned from giving its membership automatic print subscriptions, which you had to opt out of, to giving it automatic electronic, and then you had to opt into the print, which now has a charge, whereas the electronic was free. But another big aspect and advantage of electronic journals is all of the supplementary material, so the appendices, the data. There's no way to print data, and so now these journals and these publishers are able to include much more of the research project than they were before, because it is available electronically, because they can actually send you to the whatever tables or files or JSON files or whatever that are accompanying this research project. So that's a huge benefit and boon to sort of scientific reproducibility and just transparency. Is this idea of you can include so much more with the journal articles now that there were fewer and fewer page limits or data limits, and there's many more opportunities for appendices and things like that.
So I've got a couple more points here, but I think it might be a useful time to take questions from the audience if anybody has any issues they'd like to bring up for discussion or questions. Here's what I'm going to try to do. Maybe I'll take off this mic here and see if people can circulate it. I'll step aside and let you all handle the Q&A.
Thanks.
A lot of us on this end of the hill will publish in journals that are indexed either in Pubmed or PsycInfo. How useful are those indices as a screen for scanned journals? I mean, is it useful to search that journal name in those indices, and if it isn't there, take alarm?
I mean, they're great, yeah. So Medline and PsycInfo and CINAHL and all those databases we know in Web of Science, you name them that we pay money for access to, with the exception of Medline. Those are great indices. They definitely have very specific journal collection criteria policies. So and it honestly is a matter of, for you as an author, figuring out how this work is going to be disseminated. If you know all your colleagues in the field are searching these databases, and that's honestly the only way they find research, then you want your research to be indexed in those databases, to be included in those databases. Otherwise, it won't get found necessarily by your colleagues who you want to read this. So that is a very big helpful thing. But with PubMed in particular, I have to give my word of warning. Okay, so nerdy librarian term time. PubMed versus Medline versus PMC. Let's talk about the differences. So PubMed is an interface. It's basically a website through which you can search the database, which is the stuff of Medline. And Medline is the database that actually makes the selection of the fancy journals to choose. PubMed includes more than just Medline. It includes some books from the NCBI bookshelf, but it also includes everything that's in Pubmed Central. Now, Pubmed Central is a whole nother beast. Pubmed Central is a full-text repository. So normally you go to a database, you have to click on the little Find It EUF button to get the full text because the database itself doesn't have the full text of the journal article. But Pubmed Central is not that way. Pubmed Central, or PMC, is basically a full-text repository that was created to comply with NIH public access policy, i.e., if the taxpayers are paying for your research, they deserve to be able to read the products of your research. That's the whole idea. If you have an NIH, NSA, and NASA, NOAA, basically almost any federally funded grant these days, you have to make it publicly accessible through one of these repositories. Now, the trouble with this is that a lot of times you'll find a journal, a scientist will have finished their beautiful, wonderful government-funded research, and they will have chosen maybe a less than ethical publisher or journal to publish their research through. But then because of NIH public access mandates, that journal article has to be added to Pubmed Central in order to comply with the public access law. So then that journal takes that and says, oh, look, we're indexed in PMC. We're indexed in PubMed, they'll say. And that's not quite the case. But they'll use that as a marker of distinction when it wasn't any qualities of the journal that led them to being included in the Pubmed Central. It was just the fact that their journal happened to publish something that was government funded. So that's kind of a very important distinction to make, because you will see some of these scam places basically say, we're indexed in PubMed, which you should never say indexed in PubMed, you should say indexed in Medline, because PubMed's just the interface. But they'll use that, or they'll say indexed in PMC because they've got that one journal or that one article that was needed to be added to PMC because of mandates. So that is a very important distinction. It's a confusing one. You're welcome to ask further questions about it, but so be very careful about seeing exactly what terminology they use. We love Medline is the term that should be used when referring to indexed in. So side note, sorry, that was a really long answer.
I would only add that I think the point we've made several times is that there can never just be one indicator, right? That you should always have, yes, this is a good sign. Now, what are 4 other good signs that I'm seeing in this journal?
I have a follow-up comment, and then I have a question. My comment is that I always see if it's in the university's library system. If it's there, then I'll publish. Because I figured you guys have spent some time worrying about the money aspects of this. So speaking of money, what about this whole issue of turning over copyright to publishers? I mean, I'm creating this stuff, and they own the copyright. That just seems illegal.
I'll walk. I'll walk one step back and say, I'm seeing Tara say that using the library as like the only authority for it. I mean, that's a difficult thing. I mean, we're cataloging a lot of different kinds of things. There probably are a fair number of, I don't know enough about catalogs, but open access content that is probably not making it into the catalog. So yeah, I mean, it's again one thing to look at, but keeping an open mind on other indices and directories. In terms of copyright, that is one of the major benefits to me of open access publishing, and really since the beginning has been part of the value, one of the values of open access publishers is that this idea that authors should not be writing work for free, transferring their rights over to a journal, and then having it sold back to us. I mean, that is just bizarre when you describe it. And so really most journals that have open access, including journals where we haven't really talked about hybrid journals, but there are, subscription journals where you can pay to have your article open access. And even then, usually you're able to keep the copyright to your own work. And that's something often we're quickly signing these copyright transfer agreements, please don't. I mean, come to one of us. This is something in the libraries that I was hired to help with, to really support looking at some of these agreements. And that's something we hope more people do, because there are, even in cases where you're publishing with a subscription journal, there are questions that you can ask and terms that you can set. And more these publishers are used to getting these questions too. This isn't unusual anymore. They're used to a little bit of negotiation. Most open access journals do let you keep your copyright. Most of them also ask that you release your articles under a Creative Commons license, which will allow other people to copy and circulate your work.
Before we move on to the first question, I'll ask you to repeat it so that the microphone gets it. I totally agree, and that's a really important issue and relates to the broader issue of open access in general. So what could we do? I mean, the university could act in ways that encourage or require even researchers to,
Yep.
So be diplomatic since I wasn't earlier. We could navigate around these issues if we could encourage the university to take a particular stand. Could you talk about things that we could do as researchers or administrators that would push the university in that direction?
Yes. There are many universities that have come up with open access policies. And we are, as a university library, part of a group called COAPI, which is sort of a consortium of universities that have adopted these policies. I'm even on a committee. So even though we don't have one of these policies in place right now, this is a conversation that's been bubbling up over the years, long before I arrived at UF. And so there are a lot of questions to ask about these. Often these policies, and some of the models that we look at often are at places like Harvard, will sort of word things to say that the university has sort of a non-exclusive ability to disseminate this work. And the idea of that is not to strip people's rights from them, but rather to say that we should be able to sort of preemptively share a lot of articles through institutional repositories rather than allowing journals to just be the only ones who get to have copyright to them.
Yeah, so as far as what you individually could do to encourage the University of Florida or whatever universities you want to end up being at to kind of maybe adopt these policies, these types of things, a lot of these library policies and university policies are very much led and driven by faculty governance. So if you are a faculty member, I'm not going to assume everyone here is faculty, things like Faculty Senate are a great way to sort of get these issues on the table, so to show that the faculty is supporting the library's effort to increase open access or to change the way that copyright works with our publications. These are all things that, as a sort of group and a body in Faculty Senate, you can make a difference. You can make motions and sort of set out statements that say, collectively as the faculty at the University of Florida, what do you believe, what do you agree with when it comes to sort of these kinds of scholarly communications issues?
You could do the subversive thing too and change the tenure to encourage, and reward.
Yes, tenure and promotion.
You think in terms of incentives and taxes, right?
Yeah, so there's lots of different ways. So that you can get involved with your T&P committees for those of you who have tenure. You can basically change the culture of the way that publications are looked at and understood here on campus by faculty, because faculty are one of the largest drivers of a lot of the library decisions made about when it comes to what journals we subscribe to, and from something as simple as what journals we subscribe to our stances on these kinds of larger issues related to copyright and open access.
These are kind of big things. I want to offer one small thing too. When we're talking a lot about open access and how to change a huge culture, and obviously this is a years-long process. One tiny thing that you can do, if you are or have published in journals that are subscription journals, most publishers now will have a policy where you can put a peer-reviewed, accepted version of your manuscript into a non-commercial repository. So we have an institutional repository at the University of Florida. Most disciplines have various repositories. We're happy to read through the fine print of this. And again, most of them, usually there's some kind of embargo period, but even if you're not funded by a grant that forces you to make your work open or some version of your work open, this is a real possibility and something we don't honestly talk about enough, that we are, the idea of this fully open access journal is not the only path to open access, and that's really crucial since some of us, for one reason or another, still really need to be publishing in some journals that are subscription only.
And before we make sure we get to Sarah's question here, I was also going to add, if you're going to push someone else as an editor-in-chief, I think it's really important to push the journals. And that means, encouraging them to have a formal preprint policy so that, they'll accept papers for review that have been deposited in a preprint repository. You can ask the journal editors, again, especially for society journals typically rather than publish your own, you can ask them, what would it take to go to open access? Have we thought about it? What are we doing to do things like return copyright? What kind of things can an individual society journal do? And society journals tend to be very responsive about this because they're membership driven. So I think that's the other place where you can start to push for action. So I'm going to hand it over to you and let you ask your question as well.
So I've become increasingly concerned with the predatory publishing scare, increasing bias against research coming out of non-Western countries. So I just wanted to, it may be a reiteration of what you've already said, but just kind of address that so people, know to not fall into that little trap when evaluating journals.
Yes.
Another rant. Yes, another rant coming. So thank you, Tara, for setting that up for me. I mentioned earlier that the person who came up with the term predatory was a somewhat unethical individual. And he created a blacklist of journals that you shouldn't publish in because they are predatory. But one of his criteria for something being predatory was that it was published not in the United States or Europe. Which basically means that all of these journals that were very legitimate publications, local, fantastic kinds of regional journals, were getting flagged as being predatory when basically they are just from countries that are very resource limited. And so that is actually the number one main reason that I would offer to you to not ever use a blacklist, because it will tend to be something that was pulled from this individual's list, which was largely defined by the fact that only Europe and America can publish good journals, which we know is not true.
I think that's exactly right, and I would only add that that's another reason, not only blacklists, but we talked about things like Web of Science. I mean, there are places where we're often going as first points to look for a list of journals, and often we're not necessarily seeing journals from the Global South or even just outside of the United States or Europe, and we need to be cautious when we're going to those and recognize how limited they are.
And this is just, this kind of bias is harmful in many ways, not just in the I'm choosing not to, I'm only publishing in Western journals, but it also harms science in itself. So I think there was a recent Science magazine article about psychology and how all of our psychology is wrong because majority of psychology studies are being done by weirdos. This concept of Western educated, I can't remember the rest of the acronym, but it was this idea of that we tend to have a very undiverse population in a lot of our research. So by encouraging non-Western, developing nations to further the science, to further research in their areas, we're actually improving science as a whole. And that's really important, especially for science synthesis efforts like systematic reviews or evidence synthesis, that if you have a more diverse and more comprehensive perspective of the research being done by including non-Western journal articles, you have a more complete picture of the science being done. So,
to bring that back to the question of evaluation, not just identifying potential sources, but evaluating. When you asked the question about whether we could dredge through Medline and see if that told something about quality, I thought I was going to have a really great example of journals from Brazil or other countries in South America that were great examples of not being in there. And I started with the Brazilian Journal of Infectious Diseases, and it was in Medline, and then I went on to the Brazilian Journal of Nephrology, and it was also in Medline, and then I quit. So I think that, I think that these are all the right questions. It's, really important to think how do we get this kind of information to our students and our postdocs or other people in our labs or in our departments so that they too can take advantage of it? Is there a place where they can go and look online for these resources?
Yeah, there is, amazingly. So I pulled up, my predecessor did a great job of creating a bunch of guides that I'm in the process of updating. But this site, if you Google evaluating publishing venues UF, you'll find this really quickly. And this is a good place to start, where she developed this guide on a lot of the things we've talked about: think, check, submit, maintaining your rights as an author, all of these kinds of things, along with other pages on open access, ways that we support open access, discounts through publishers. So these are the places to look. If you Google even copyright UF or any of these kinds of things, you'll start to run into these guides. And we really try to use these as a central place to put a lot of these resources. And obviously, we're happy to talk to you individually and to your students as well. A part of my job, really day to day, is consulting with people individually. So a lot of these questions, unfortunately, all of these guides can get us started, but a lot of what we're talking about is about the fine print, is about sort of wading through something. So we really are happy to come and talk to classes, to just have students referred to us. I work with a lot of students individually as well.
Yeah, that's a huge part of what we do as librarians. So, like, as a personal librarian for the College of Nursing, I'm your first stop, and then if you stump me, I get Perry, because Perry knows more than me about this issue. But yeah, a lot of it is getting in on the ground floor. So for me, my advice would be less about what to do and what not to do, which is I keep hearing from a lot of students that, oh, well, my advisor says, my professor says that I can only publish in these places. And I hate that sentence. It kills me, because it makes these students feel stifled. It makes them feel like they're having to meet this requirement, and that it feels like they're having to limit the scope of their scholarship because of the eventual place that it's going to be published in. And so I really encourage you to have an open mindset, because yes, your students will listen to you and take what you say as gospel. So rather than just giving them, oh, publish in these 4 places, say, go find a place to publish and do some research and see if it works for you, and let them do the work of finding places to publish and using these tools that we've so thoughtfully provided, rather than just sort of giving them a restrictive list of places they're allowed to publish their work.
I don't have too much to add to that. My colleagues gave a very brilliant summation of different things that you can do, but I will just say thank you all for coming, and I especially want to thank Dr. Bruna for helping moderate this session, and to my colleagues, Maggie and Perry, for all of the wonderful comments and contributions. And then just reiterate that the library is a great place to ask about these kinds of questions, and we are always willing to come and talk to people or to groups about these issues.
Final word to me, thanks a lot to all three of you.